Welcome back to the afternoon session of the Just Data virtual conference. My name is Nguzine Delue, and I'm the Innocence Project's special advisor on race and wrongful conviction. We have a great conversation lined up for you, but we're going to start with a short piece to frame our discussion about the way that bias can distort new technology. Thank you to Giselle Rentas for suggesting this introduction. And now we'll play the trailer.
During my first semester at MIT, I got computer vision software that was supposed to track my face. It didn't work until I put on this white mask. I'm thinking, all right, what's going on here? Is it the lighting conditions? Is it the angle at which I'm looking at the camera, or is there something more? That's when I started looking into issues of bias that can creep into technology.
Our ideas about technology that we think are normal are actually ideas that come from a very small and homogeneous group of people.
Vast amounts of data at incredible speeds.
Everybody has unconscious biases, and people embed their own biases into technology.
This kid got stopped as a result of facial recognition misidentification, and then used that as justification to search you. This is an innocent child.
Racism is becoming mechanized.
Systemic issues are only going to be hardwired into new technologies.
It's not just face classification, it's any data-centric technology.
Every day, we are all being scored.
Who gets hired, who gets housing.
I am making predictions for your life right now.
The people who own the code deploy it on other people, and there is no accountability.
Management at Atlantic Towers wanted to install the facial recognition software. Pretty much turn this place into Fort Knox.
The technology is being rapidly adopted, and there are no safeguards.
We are socially controlled in a way that we don't see.
Technology that analyzes faces could be biased, but the company is pushing it anyway.
What demographic is it most effective on?
White men.
Show me that it's going to be fair, that it's legal, before you put it out. That's what we don't have yet.
It's going to take people coming together, striving for justice in this age of automation.
So with that video, we know that we have a lot to talk about in this segment. And for this conversation, I am joined by two extraordinary people. I'm joined by Mitha Nandagaplan and Sierra Robeson. And let me give you a short introduction to both of their backgrounds. Mitha Nandagaplan joined the Innocence Project's Strategic Litigation Department as a staff attorney in February 2023 to work on the Neighborhood Project, focusing on the community impacts of racialized police surveillance and mass misdemeanor arrests. Before joining the Innocence Project, Mitha represented individuals facing criminal charges as an assistant public defender at the law offices of the Public Defender of New Mexico in Albuquerque. Prior to that, they clerked for Justice Susan Carney on the Alaska Supreme Court in Fairbanks. They graduated in 2018 with a JD from Harvard Law School, where their clinical work focused on representing indigent tenants facing eviction and housing discrimination. And they hold a master's from Hunter College and a BA from NYU. I'm also joined by Sierra Robeson, who is the Associate Director of the Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab at Princeton University, where she guides student research teams in partnership with community organizations to conduct data-driven, justice-oriented research. She holds a BA in African American Studies from Princeton University and is a doctoral candidate in the Sociology and Social Policy program at Harvard, where she researches the impact of technological advancements within the criminal justice system. So thanks to you both for joining us for this conversation, and I'm going to just dive right in. I'll start with you, Sierra. The trailer for Coded Bias gave us some examples of how new technology can perpetuate biases. I'd like to focus on the way that we see technology being used in policing and what the ramifications are for wrongful convictions. So, can you start by explaining to us some of the new ways that this technology is being deployed in the criminal legal system, and particularly in the policing context? Also, tell us what concerns you have about the ways these tools can be used to entrench existing patterns of racial inequity.
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I'm so excited to be in dialogue with you all. So I should start by saying that surveillance technologies are used throughout the criminal legal system, all the way from even before a police officer steps on a beat, all the way up until a defendant is up for probation or parole. At every stage of policing, arrest, pretrial, the trial period, the sentencing period, technologies are used with detrimental consequences for racial inequality in particular. But today I'll focus on the policing and pretrial phase, particularly because they highlight the ways that we experience wrongful convictions. So at this point, there are over 3,000 jurisdictions in the United States that use at least one kind of predictive policing, surveillance, or algorithmic policing tool. And many of the largest cities actually use more than one of these technologies. These technologies are super duper far ranging, everything from body worn cameras to facial recognition technologies, license plate readers, gang databases, drones, ShotSpotter, which is a technology that essentially sends a signal to police when there's a gunshot, or what the technology thinks is a gun. We can get in a little bit more if interested. And even things like predictive policing technologies, which tell police where they should be patrolling and who they should be surveilling. There are many, many more, but these are just some of the broad strokes of the kinds of technologies that we're seeing on the ground. And these technologies have been critiqued by a variety of different people for a variety of different reasons, but for the most part, these critiques fall into three separate categories. So first, many will argue that the very data that the tools are built on rely on data that is biased by historical practices of racialized criminalization. Second, scholars especially have argued that these tools disproportionately harm communities of color because of where they're deployed. And third, people will argue that these tools fundamentally reshape how policing is done in ways that fundamentally reshape and influence inequality. So I'll take each one of these in turn, just explaining a little bit what's going on in each of these. So perhaps one of the biggest critiques is this idea that biased data in is equal to biased data out. So by nature of the fact that many of these tools are algorithms, they use historic data to predict future crime. And many of these tools are using racially biased metrics that get at these concepts. So rather than using things like true crime rates, for which there aren't really any good measures, these algorithms use things like proxies. So 911 calls, for example, arrest records, conviction records. And we know that communities of color, and especially communities of different races, commit crimes at the same rate. But we also know that Black and brown communities are over-policed. And so 911 calls, arrests, convictions are going to look different in each of these different communities, just by nature of the way that these people have been policed over time. So this leads to point two. These tools are disproportionately used in communities of color, in part because of the data that feeds these algorithms in the first place. So the bad data not only produces bad data out, it also produces data that feeds the algorithm for later predictions. So the bad data out becomes a key component of the algorithmic system, and current practices of policing end up themselves becoming data. So today's policing practices are used to predict 2024's trends, 2025's trends, and so on and so forth. Beyond these issues, though, there are also really interesting ways that tech shapes the very nature of policing. So I have the really great fortune to call Dr. Sarah Brain at UT Austin one of my advisors. And her work, particularly in her book, Predict and Surveil, about the Los Angeles Police Department, highlights the ways in which data-driven technologies fundamentally change policing away from a practice that was really reactive, responding to 911 calls, responding to issues that people call in about, towards a proactive practice. And in so doing, it captures individuals who had not previously been captured by the policing apparatus. And she terms this net widening. So consider, for example, a predictive algorithm like the one that's present in Pasco County in Florida, which uses school records to label children at risk. And these designations are based on a variety of different variables, like your grades, your attendance, and even things like whether you've been a victim of assault at home and whether Child Protective Services has been called on your family. So while you might think that this designation may indicate a need for services for the child, actually, this list of at-risk kids is fed to police, who use this list as an opportunity to pay especially a close attention to students that otherwise would not have been on their radar. In addition to this, all data is very networked. So every bit of data that you produce is not only linked to you, but also those in your immediate surroundings. DNA, for example, not only implicates your own genome, but also some of the even most remote relatives in your family, even relatives that haven't yet been born. So these linkages occur for nearly every form of data and can often be used as a cause to surveil and police individuals who are peripheral to an individual who is of police interest. All of these critiques have implications for wrongful conviction, primarily because many of them put more people in the crosshairs of police activity in ways that are not substantiated by an actual threat, but instead a risk of a threat. And I'm happy to get into more details of these examples in the Q&A, but for there, I'll just pause.
Thanks so much. So from there, actually, I'll turn to Mifa. I think given that you are doing this work within a wrongful conviction framework, I'm really interested in how you see these technologies showing up, not just perpetuating inequities, but also in producing potentially wrongfully convictions. So how are you seeing these technologies showing up in our work to prevent and right wrongful convictions? And in particular, what questions do we need to address about the use of surveillance technologies?
Thank you, Ngozi, and thank you for having me at this conference. I'm really excited to be here and to be in conversation with you and Sierra. As far as how these technologies are showing up, they're showing up quite a lot. We're seeing a number of cases that involve technologies like facial recognition, technologies like ShotSpotter, people who may have been brought into contact with police and with the criminal legal system as a result of a predictive policing algorithm, as a result of an automatic license plate reader. And what these technologies do is sometimes allow law enforcement, allow police to, as Sierra laid out, bypass any individualized link to any particular offense, right? They're bringing people in contact through an entire neighborhood that might have ShotSpotter installed, through inclusion in a facial recognition database that in and of itself might be biased. And so it's, I would argue, raising the risk of wrongful conviction by raising that risk of exposure to police, regardless of individual involvement in any criminal activity. And that's disproportionately falling on Black and Brown communities. You pose a good question in terms of what questions ought we to be asking. And I can break that down in a number of ways, but I think the macro question is whether surveillance actually is making us safer. And if it's not, then who is it serving and who is it harming? When we think about the surveillance technologies that are already being used or that are contemplating being used in a particular city or a particular jurisdiction, we can think about the sort of pipeline or life cycle of a technology from development to impacts, right? So we can think about the development, the procurement, the deployment of the technology, once deployed, how it's used, and then the impacts that then has on a community, on a neighborhood, on residents, and whether there's any accountability for those impacts. So when we look at development, that's usually happening in private tech companies. And so there, I would ask, who's at the table and what are their incentives? Joy Bolong-Winnie, who was quoted briefly in the trailer that you just played at the beginning of the session, who's a computer scientist, poet, and digital activist, conceptualized this idea of the coded gaze, right? This idea that algorithms, data, and technology reflect the priorities, preferences, and often the prejudices of the people who generate them. And when the people who generate them are mostly affluent, mostly white, mostly male, and mostly at minimal risk themselves for direct police contact on a day-to-day basis, that gets reflected in the data that goes in to a piece of technology. Any algorithm, any piece of technology is a product of human choices, and that is always, unless we're guarding really carefully against it, an avenue for bias to slip in. Rashida Richardson has done a tremendous amount of work on looking at biased data, biased algorithms, and even where you can't necessarily point to like explicit racial bias, right? There's a question about accuracy. I'll take ShotSpotter as a quick example. Sierra brought that up briefly. That's a technology that claims to use microphones installed around a given neighborhood to try to detect and triangulate the location of possible gunfire, right? And they use a machine learning algorithm to try to separate out what the algorithm thinks is actually gunfire from sounds that are similar but unrelated: cars backfiring, construction noises, other loud urban noises, right? But what we know is that the data that algorithm is trained on, it's not always known whether a particular recording that the algorithm is using as training data to say, okay, this was labeled as gunfire by the human putting it in, I'm going to treat this as gunfire, sounds similar to this are going to be treated as gunfire going forward. We don't know the ground truth for the sound clips, the sound recordings that went into that. So if a sound clip of a car backfiring was mislabeled as a gunshot in the training data, that's going to be replicated in the algorithm and bring police to a neighborhood for something that isn't actually a threat or a crime or something needing police involvement. When we look at procurement, we have to think about what are the pathways that put surveillance technology at the disposal of law enforcement. So that's what are the funding streams that are going into this, and what information do, say, municipal governments, state governments, city councils, civilian review boards, even law enforcement agencies themselves have before deciding whether to contract with, say, a facial recognition company or ShotSpotter or a vendor for a predictive policing algorithm, and what should those deciding criteria be, right? Is the technology actually claiming, is it actually doing what it's claiming to do? And even if it is that going to disproportionately harm Black and brown communities in particular? Is that going to disproportionately affect certain neighborhoods? Is that going to decrease trust in local government? And are there better ways to spend that money? When we look at deployment, we then have to look at where and how surveillance technology, where and how it's being used. ShotSpotter, for instance, is disproportionately deployed in Black and brown neighborhoods. And in some cases, even comparing neighborhoods with similar rates of, say, 911 calls for service for suspected gunfire, you're more likely to get ShotSpotter installed in the more disproportionately Black or brown neighborhood in that case. And when you have instances of overlapping forms of surveillance, a neighborhood that has a bunch of license plate readers that is labeled as a hotspot by a predictive policing algorithm, where there's drones overhead every day, where there's ShotSpotter, who is bearing a disproportionate brunt of that surveillance load? And then we also have to ask, how are humans, say detectives, analysts, policymakers, interacting with that technology? And how is the technology then creating a feedback loop, as Sierra illustrated with the case of Los Angeles, into changing human decision-making and behavior? Is it causing law enforcement to shortcut investigations? Is it biasing investigations? When a police officer runs a facial recognition search, are they just issuing an arrest warrant based on the result of that search with no follow-up investigation? And if so, is that undercutting the protections, like the constitutional Fourth Amendment requirements that are meant to guard against that type of police overreach? And those are all I would classify sort of diagnostic questions, like diagnosing the problems, the pitfalls, the potential harms, the risks. But once we know what those are, then the final question that I would pose is an action-oriented one. Where are the most effective points for those of us who are aware of those risks to start interrupting the process and putting in the guardrails that will actually keep us safe from the potential dangers of the technology itself? That was kind of a longish answer, but I'll leave it there and we can get into more depth in the Q&A.
No, that was great. I think that trying to kind of frame the questions that we are asking, this is one of the real focuses of this conference, is to both talk about the answers we have, but also what we need to do to actually dive deeper. And I have another question for you both about that. Before that, I just wanted to kind of point to a practical example that we've seen as far as wrongful arrest, at least, where we had, based on facial recognition technology in Detroit, an 8.5-month pregnant Black woman was arrested in front of her children for a crime that she absolutely couldn't possibly have committed, but it was just based on this mistaken facial recognition technology. So we know that those stories are out there. I know, Meetha, that your work here, and Sierra, that your broader work is uncovering these issues and also looking at the big picture of how we address these issues. So I want to dig deeper for that research community to think about this. For both of you, what do you see as the research frontiers in your understanding of the role of surveillance technology in the criminal legal system? And I know that both of you from different areas are really, addressing this directly in your work. So what are the research frontiers? Where should we be looking to get the answers that we'll need for advocacy in the future?
Sure, I can start on this one. So I'd really like to applaud the creative research that happens in this space, mostly because I think causal quantitative work is sometimes lauded as the gold standard of research. But I'm so impressed by individuals who conduct rigorous descriptive research and generously take the time to create publicly accessible databases and spend years in the field conducting qualitative research with interviews or ethnographies. I'm in the midst of finishing my PhD, and many of the ideas that I had for my dissertation simply could not be answered because the little d data, like the administrative data sets, did not exist, or it was extremely expensive for a graduate student to reasonably request them. And so many folks in power just simply can't imagine that such data might be important to keep or collect. And when they do imagine it, they don't have an incentive to collect data that on practices that might be negative for them. So for example, the government does not collect data on police killings, or didn't until quite recently. And it took a group of activists to scour news sources and create a database that quantitative researchers could use. But without these individuals who did the not so fancy work of just kind of scouring the news, we wouldn't be able to run these regressions that I think are providing really awesome research insights to us today. So like descriptive work, qualitative work really helps redefine what constitutes important questions and helps point out some mechanisms that might otherwise be lost in really large scale data. And my own research, for example, focuses on how algorithms in the pretrial space function. And I specifically examine how lawyers use risk assessment tools to advocate for their clients, which is a seemingly simple intervention, admittedly. Lawyers exist in courtrooms, and so we would expect that a whole bunch of research would focus on how they use these algorithms. Yet these really important actors have been entirely left out of the literature, in part because most of the administrative data that we have only focuses on judges and the decisions that they make. So I just want to say here that I think some of the best work are those pieces of work that do the work of kind of creating these big data sets, of looking and doing qualitative research to try and figure out exactly what might be going on to answer some of these tough questions that we may not have the data to support in the administrative data sets or in the larger scale quantitative data that might be heralded as the gold standard right now.
I would second that, and also add that sort of an area where I think there has been some research, but there needs to be more of how technology is playing out in the field, right? What are the intersections between human decision making and surveillance technology itself? And then what is that doing in communities? And that I think is can lend itself both to the sort of quantitative, causal inference based work, but also to the, kind of participatory reaction research, interview based, focus group based, research driven by identifying community needs and responding to those. I think there is a lot of space for that and a lot of need for that. I think one of the challenges with research in this space is often that you're facing, as Sierra, you probably encountered in your own research, both just a lack of wherewithal to gather and generate the data needed, and even where there might be wherewithal or incentive to do that on one front, a lack of transparency on the part of the entities that would hold that data, right? Police departments are notoriously reluctant to share, say, internal disciplinary records for police or internal records for, how many times they might be pursuing a particular investigative tactic or using a particular technology. But then once, if you can get your hands on that kind of data, I think this is sort of a meta question to the question of what the research frontiers are. I think we also have to be really careful in thinking about who is that research accountable to, right? Because if we're gathering a bunch of data about cases or police investigations or instances of facial recognition use or, shot spotter alerts, right? Those are data regarding people's lives who are being affected by this technology. And if the people who are being affected don't have access to that information, don't have control over what of their personal information and what of their stories is getting used for research and shared, and if they're not benefiting from that, then we have a problem where the research itself can run the risk of just reinforcing the same inequities that the technology itself is furthering, and kind of become a tool for that larger trend and historical pattern of racial bias.
I think that's so important to talk about, and I think both you, Mitha, and Sierra mentioned this. It's also not just about what needs to be researched, but how and who has access, and how that is actually encouraging or supporting the communities that are most affected by these technologies. I want us to focus in again specifically about wrongful convictions. And we know from our experience here, where we've had, one of the longest known DNA exonerations, Mr. Leonard Mack, with 48 years between conviction and exoneration, that oftentimes we are dealing with remedying the problems of the past to the extent that we can, right? Like, we're dealing with the criminal legal system of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the mistakes and the misconduct that was existing there and then. So I want us to be able to think about this and look into our future. So if we don't take action now, if we don't actually figure out how to address these technologies. What do you see happening with the technology of today that would be fueling the exonerations of 2045? How do we need to course correct to prevent these wrongful convictions?
I can start on that one. I think we, for one, certainly need more oversight, information, transparency upfront before any surveillance technologies get deployed in our communities. And I get that in many cities, arguably that ship has sailed and we're in a mitigation phase of things rather than a prevention phase of things. But when we know, for instance, that of the 7, now 8, I think, known cases of facial recognition technology misidentifying someone who was then subsequently arrested for it, every single one of them has been a Black person, right? We know that the folks who were, there's a lawsuit happening right now out of Chicago with a number of plaintiffs who were arrested as police were responding to a ShotSpotter alert, but then unconnected with any gun crimes and unclear if the alert was even accurately detecting gunfire, right? Those are all happening in Black neighborhoods. So one of the issues that we're running into, particularly in the cases that I've been working on, is that courts are often sort of ill-equipped to remedy that from the back end, right? If a facial recognition search only gets used at the investigative phase and the prosecutor says, oh no, we're not going to offer this at trial, we're just going to play the surveillance video and put the person that we've charged, in the courtroom at the defense table, and let the jury decide, do they look close enough alike that we think they're the same person? You're basically having the jury do a biased, suggestive show-up identification on the spot at the trial phase when it's too late for the technology itself and its accuracy, its reliability, its potential for bias to be scrutinized, right? So where we don't necessarily have good judicial mechanisms to bring that scrutiny, bring that gatekeeping, and bring those guardrails in place, really we would need them at the procurement stage, and even before that, honestly, at the development stage. I think to some degree, the recent Biden administration executive order on AI at least acknowledges some of those risks. Whether it goes far enough to requiring companies to actually assess them pre-deployment in a way that's enforceable and effective remains to be seen. I mean, personally, I think we have a long way to go on that front. But we should be looking at surveillance technology from the standpoint of, as Sierra laid out at the beginning, who is this sweeping into the ambit of police enforcement? And particularly, who does it risk sweeping into the ambit of the criminal legal system in the absence of any actual evidence of criminal activity, right? Who are the people who are getting swept in just by virtue of who they're friends with on social media? Who are the people who are getting swept in just by virtue of what neighborhood they live in, right? If police are responding to a ShotSpotter alert and they're allowed to stop every car with a broken taillight within a mile radius, and I actually had a case or worked on a case where essentially that happened, then what does that mean for everyone who's driving through that neighborhood within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a mile away of the location of that ShotSpotter alert? That person then has fewer constitutional protections, more risk for police contact for unrelated reasons than someone living in a neighborhood where that technology hasn't been deployed. And all of these need to be assessed prior to putting that surveillance technology into action. So that's at the level of deciding whether or not to fund the purchase or fund a contract with, Clearview AI or with ShotSpotter. And at the level of, if companies are marketing this technology, does their marketing actually reflect what the technology does or doesn't do? And what have they done up front to try to ensure that the data they're using to train their algorithms is not biased, or to mitigate or counter the biases that are in the data?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Mitha. I mean, I think the question of scrutiny is so important for course correcting and for preventing future harm. One of the things that I also want to highlight, though, is that while much of our focus is often on these top-down kind of state-sanctioned uses of technology, there's also a lot of really interesting and innovative ways that technology is being created from the bottom up to resist, to protest, to help get the word out about all of these different things. And so I want to highlight a few examples that I think are particularly awesome. One is an app called Appalition, which, like many of the micro investing apps, asks users to round their transactions up to the nearest dollar and donate the extra change to a mutual aid organization, which helps pay cash bail for folks. And this helps reduce pleas that folks make just to avoid jail time simply because they don't have the money to pay cash bail. Another example is the work of computer scientists and scholars who kind of flip the script on algorithmic recommendations. And so rather than attempting to use algorithms to predict which individuals are likely to commit crimes, they change the focus and they create algorithms that predict which judges or police officers are likely to abuse their power, which I think is particularly awesome. And these technologies kind of help weed individuals in the system out who can kind of continue creating these wrongful convictions because they're abusing their discretion, for example, or they're not adhering to some of the laws that we have in place to prevent things like wrongful convictions. And another kind of really fun example that I really like is some of the speculative work that happens in this space. So there are a series of fashion designers out there who create clothes that scramble facial recognition technology with really graphic and colorful patterns that confuse the machine learning in these technologies. And so you might imagine a world where protesters, for example, all wear these really brightly colored and actually quite beautiful garments at once in order not only to protect themselves, but also to protect each other. And so all of these examples of organizing with tech, holding folks in power to account, and even resisting with technology can be used not only to overturn wrongful convictions, but also to prevent them from happening in the future.
Thank you for that hopeful note, and we'll continue with that before I give you, or I'll give you a depressing statistic before we continue with a hopeful note. I just wanted to make sure to highlight your point about guilty pleas, pretrial detention, and wrongful convictions and race. So we know that for the many people we have had about 7 million jail admissions every year. We know that the vast majority of these folks are pre-trial, have not been convicted of anything. And we also know that when you are in pretrial detention, there's a lot of pressure to plead guilty, get out as quickly as you can, no matter what the stakes. And so if we think about that in the context of wrongful convictions, we know from the National Registry of Exoneration that nearly 25% of those who've been exonerated since 1989 pled guilty. So these are people who didn't do it, but pled guilty to it. And of that number, 75% are Black and Brown people. So we see that the role that all of these systems play combined to have this disparate effect. And we also know that technology can play a role there as well. But Sierra, I'll go back to your hopeful and optimistic place. So we're gonna stay in that space for a moment. So I want to hear from both of you about the connections that you see between litigation, research, and community activism around technology. Sierra, you started us off with some great examples. Do you want to continue us along that trend? Like, how are we seeing? Because I feel like this is a very dynamic space, actually, with technology, that there has been this isn't a place where people are operating in silos, that there has been a really good conversation, dialogue, and community engagement to take, action and be powerful in this space. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the questions that's always on my mind is something that Meetha brought up earlier, and that a lot of comments in the chat have been talking about, which is this question of corporate complicity in the creation of these technologies. More often than not, private companies create these algorithms and then they sell them to police departments, ICE, Border Patrol, et cetera. And this obviously brings up a lot of issues, but one of the things that's really at the forefront of my brain is the question of how we hold our governments accountable when the technologies that they're using are often proprietary. They're protected by intellectual property regulation. So, for example, in New York, there's a legal battle happening right now because some of the algorithms that the state is using to determine whether an individual should be released on parole, we don't actually know what variables go into and out of calculating that score because the algorithm is copyrighted to the company. So we can't see what goes into and out of it, and therefore can't challenge any issues that might arise with it. So I think this is an incredibly important issue for everyone to kind of take up and do what they can where they are. For defense attorneys and defendant advocates, for example, you can challenge the algorithms that are being used in your cases by creating a legal record, trying to push for legislation around these technologies, appealing decisions where the algorithm, for example, makes no sense. For scholars that study the impact of these technologies, particularly focus on private companies. I mean, it's one of those things that's really difficult to do. I attempted and was met with a lot of frustrated tech employees. It's really difficult to get in touch with those folks, to get data on these folks, to even talk to these folks, but it's a really important area to study. And then for the everyday person, kind of find out who controls your city budget. Speak out, petition your local comptrollers who are often in charge of procuring technologies, and mandate that the algorithms that they procure be publicly available, particularly for this issue. You can do a whole bunch of different things on a bunch of different scales, whether that's at the legal side, the legislative side, the scholarship side, or even just like the local organizing side of things. So I think there's lots of room for hope and lots of room for resistance here.
I would agree with that, and just sort of look for ways to turn the scrutiny back on the entities whose technology, whose manpower, and whose resources are being used to scrutinize us, right? Sierra gave some amazing examples of that, both for this question and the previous question. I would also point to Stop LAPD Spying, which posted a list of officers with their pictures and their bios so that residents could essentially know which officers were in their neighborhoods and what their records of excessive force complaints were, right? So that's I think one avenue. I think also there's been some success in a few cities at least of getting companies that are sort of taking on what have traditionally been publicly essentially public functions of law enforcement contracted to themselves, subject to the same disclosure requirements that a public government entity would be. So Freedom of Information Act, Sunshine Law, public records disclosures, with the rationale being that if they're going to be essentially acting as a proxy for government-based law enforcement, they should meet at minimum the same transparency requirements. I think this may have been in the chat, but I think there's also a risk there of whether they would then try to claim the same immunities, qualified immunity, for instance, that police officers in most jurisdictions and at the federal level are entitled to by judicial precedent, not by anything in statute or constitution. And so that's kind of a double-edged sword. But if I think there's a strong case to be made, right, that if a private company is performing essentially a public function, but it's not accountable to or transparent to the public in the same way that a government entity would be, That's a problem, and it should be. And even just like, how many of you listening now can say for sure, like, do you have ShotSpotter in your neighborhood? Do you think your face is in a facial recognition database? How many cameras are on your block? If you walk from your house or your apartment to the bodega, to the grocery store, to your child's school, how many times is your face being captured on a traffic camera, right? If we don't know these things about our own neighborhoods, we don't even know the extent to which our own data is being collected. We won't have a sense of what to do about it. So that's just at the initial level of asking those questions, right? That is a starting point to then translate into organizing, into showing up at your city council meeting, into commenting on a city budget or a state budget, writing to your local, state, national politicians, and even just organizing like on your block, right? I had a recent conversation with a bunch of neighbors on my block at our block association about policing patterns in my neighborhood of New York, which is one of the more over-policed neighborhoods. And it was a fairly intense discussion. People had different opinions about things, but it allowed us to collectively have more information about how we just walking down the streets, sitting on our neighbors' stoops, might be being surveilled.
Okay. With that, we are going to transition to question and answer for the last about 10 minutes of this segment. And just so folks know, after the segment, we're going to take a lunch break and return at 1:45. So I know that our panelists have already been kind of starting to answer questions that are popping up in the comments, but if folks have questions, please put them in the comments and we'll work to answer as many as we can. I'm going to start with the question that's come up a few times about the tools that we have right now and whether we have the tools that we need to actually address the issues that are coming up with this new technology, surveillance, and these potential ways that people are getting routed into the criminal legal system, and particularly in communities of color. Like, do we know, like, when we're thinking about the courts, the legislatures, direct action regulators, do we know if there are tools that are missing that need to be put in place? Do we see places, I think Mitha mentioned how sometimes the courts don't have the tools specifically to address things at the time of trial that should really be addressed earlier. So could you talk a little bit about kind of like existing gaps with the different people that or different institutions that we have in place right now, and maybe what might be done about that?
I can start on that unless Sierra, you want to jump in. Okay. So bad news and good news. The bad news is I think there are significant gaps. When we look, say, at the development stage of technology, right? We don't have meaningful federal, state, local oversight yet. Although I think Congress at least is starting to take this somewhat more seriously and with more of a sense of urgency on what kinds of data review companies need to do before they scrape data to train an algorithm, what kinds of testing they need to do for trying to preemptively detect bias and root it out, and what kinds of ongoing retesting, reevaluation, accountability they need to be doing post-deployment to make sure that the tools that they've built aren't having harmful effects. So that is a gap. There's movement on it, maybe not fast enough, but I'm hopeful that we will see sort of more urgency and more change on that front. I think on the city and local level, particularly, your average city council member like probably doesn't have a master's degree in machine learning, right? Some of them might, which is awesome. If you do, then you should be asking the questions when companies come to you trying to sell law enforcement technology that may or may not rest on biased data. But I think, would say a city council member contemplating buying ShotSpotter necessarily know to ask, hey, what was your set of training data? Do you know for sure which clips in your training data were gunshots and which were cars and which were jackhammers and which were something else? And if you don't, then how do you know your technology is working? To even sort of know what questions to ask to actually get the answers that you would need to make an informed decision, that's not trivial, right? And so to the extent that I think it takes a fair amount of work and it takes a lot of sort of local organizing, advocacy, learning, co-teaching, sharing that information to even put those questions in the hands of decision makers on the procurement side, so that they're not going to just rubber stamp something based on the advertising promotions of the company that's trying to sell them the product. I think that's sort of like capacity for that is something that we need to build at a local government and at a grassroots level. And then on sort of the court side, right, I think there's a lot of room to educate all of the players involved and then figure out what are going to be the accountability mechanisms, the enforcement mechanisms, and what are the remedies, right? If there's not a meaningful remedy, if you're wrongfully arrested because of a facial recognition hit, it's going to keep happening, right? But if police departments know that they're going to be liable for that, if they know that they're going to face consequences for that, if they know that they could get suspended for not doing a follow-up investigation when they get a facial recognition match and just issuing the warrant without any follow-up, right? Those are all sort of pressure points that we can try to leverage to bring that accountability, that transparency, and that oversight back in.
I know we have tons of questions, so I won't take super long here, but I just want to follow up on one of Mitha's points here, particularly about government officials not really knowing what's going on with technology. I think this is a very fundamental flaw with our democracy, just kind of writ large. And it has to do with technology, but it has to do with so many other things. The Supreme Court famously said that they're not the 9 greatest experts on tech. And many of our Congress people don't even really know how the internet works. And I can't help but imagine that part of that is because so many of them are not digital natives and don't actually use these technologies in the same ways that we do. And so part of me feels like we need a little bit more democratization in terms of the people who are in power. We need to see more representation in Congress, both of people who are, proficient in machine learning language, but then also people who are young, people who are in depth in these conversations kind of every single day, just by nature of the things that they experience online. And then the last thing is that algorithms are complicated, but they're also really not that complicated, all it really takes is understanding a set of rules. That's what an algorithm is understanding a set of rules that a computer is programmed to do on its own. And so kind of getting into a growth mindset in our government and in our communities where we can actually learn kind of how an algorithm works, how to actually intervene, how it's trained on data. All of these things are things that we can learn, and we actually have the resources to learn. But I think big tech likes to paint it as this really complicated and confusing thing that we're not actually able to participate in as everyday citizens. So those are the 2 things that I'd highlight there.
Great. And Sierra, I'm going to go right back to you as a social science researcher. So what can this is from S.C. Blankson Turner. What can social science researchers do to assist with battling these technologies imposed on us without our permission, particularly on communities of color? Are there projects out there that have been published that would be a good place to jump off?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the biggest things that I can do is, and that I can say, is to turn to community organizations who are organizing around this work. For the most part, they have tons of questions that they have personally experienced that they want the answers to, and they are looking for rigorous ways to test certain hypotheses, to prove certain things in the data that either they don't have the time or the resources to do on their own. And so one of the things that I do at the Just Data Lab in New Jersey at Princeton is we work with community organizations, and we literally go to them and we say, what research do you need done? Like, we'll do it for you. Like, how can we use our social science skills, our econ, our sociology, our political science, our history to help you further your mission? And drawing lessons from these organizations. One that I'm thinking of, there are so many, but one that I'm thinking of in particular is Mi Gente. They're a really great organization that focuses on campaigns called like No Tech for ICE. They're specifically focused on immigration, which isn't necessarily related to wrongful convictions, but in a way is. And there's all sorts of other different organizations, which I'm happy to follow up with the organizers and send a list if interested.
And Mitha, this one's for you. From Michael Marsh, what potential does AI have for exonerations, if any? And I know that's a big question, so maybe a mini answer to the big question.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it does have some potential because, you know, we know, at least for those cases that are susceptible to exoneration by the mechanisms that we have now, DNA, new evidence, newly discovered evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, right? And that's not every case where there's been a wrongful conviction, but at least for those cases where we sort of have mechanisms to achieve exonerations, we also have a body of research into what the drivers of each of those wrongful convictions was. We have data that identify some of the leading causes of wrongful convictions in cases that, you know, were later susceptible to exonerations, right? And it's a massive amount of time for anyone to read a trial record or go through an investigation, but could there be a way for AI to sort of be able to process multiple records and sort of identify like, hey, these are the cases that are potentially showing risk factors to avoid? And could we do that before we even get to the stage of a conviction, to flag things at the investigation stage, say, hey, this is a risk factor, it needs more follow-up. This transcript of a confession shows signs of coercion, that needs a follow-up, that needs, you know, for a defense attorney to look at. I could potentially see that being really powerful. I would caveat that with, we don't want to be relying solely on technology to make those decisions for us, because it's going to miss stuff. It's going to miss cases that we should be paying attention to. And so at best, it can be a tool, a supplement. It should not be a substitute for the needs and self-identified priorities of over-policed communities.
All right. Well, with that, there's so much more to be said. This was a wonderful panel. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And we know that this is just the very beginning of a great conversation. So thank you all for being with us. We are going to be taking a break until 1:45 when we're going to have some amazing speakers to continue on this. I believe we'll be starting with Professor Jennifer Eberhardt at that time. So looking forward to continuing this conference with everyone.